What happens when a film dares to go too far? When it refuses to blink? When the camera keeps rolling after the audience has looked away? The 80s saw an explosion of brutality on screen as filmmakers tested the limits of what censors would allow. These were not just movies, they were warnings, each banned, each buried, but each unforgettable. Today we unearth the 15 most brutal exploitation films of the 1980s that got banned. Number 15, Cannibal Ferox, 1981. It arrived like a scream from the jungle. Cannibal Ferox was marketed as the most violent film ever made, a claim that would later come back to haunt it. Directed by Umberto Lenzi, it followed three travelers who entered the Amazon, seeking to disprove myths of cannibal tribes. What they found instead was a world where civilization collapsed into blood and vengeance. The story's rawness was unrelenting, every frame dripping with sweat dirt and dread. Critics dismissed it as sadistic, while audiences lined up just to see if they could stomach it. Even the tagline was a provocation, claiming it made Cannibal Holocaust look tame. But here's where the trouble began. Authorities in the United Kingdom seized the film, labeling it a video nasty. Entire copies were destroyed under obscenity laws. Distributors were fined, and Lenzi himself was barred from public screenings. The outrage was so loud, it echoed for years across continents. Behind the scenes, the production was chaotic. Shot in the jungles of Colombia, under brutal heat, with actors facing real dangers. Rumors spread that some of the gore might be real, that animals were actually harmed, that truth blurred into myth. Eventually, Cannibal Ferox became banned in over 30 countries. Its name whispered among collectors as a test of endurance. Yet decades later, it found new life on uncut DVD releases and midnight film circuits. Its legacy both cursed and revered. In the end, Cannibal Ferox was not about cannibals. It was about how far humans will go when civilization vanishes. Number 14, I Spit on Your Grave, 1980. Few films sparked such venomous debate. Miyazarki's I Spit on Your Grave was called everything from feminist revenge fantasy to moral obscenity. Shot in rural New York with a small budget and smaller crew. It followed a woman writer brutalized and left for dead, who returns to deliver merciless retribution. At release, the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Major critics refused to review it, calling it revolting. Tabloids demanded it be banned. Theaters dropped it mid-run. Protests erupted outside cinemas. Zarki defended his vision, insisting it was about survival and empowerment. But outrage drowned nuance. Censors in the United Kingdom banned it outright, classifying it as one of the most dangerous films ever made. Scenes were cut or destroyed in multiple countries, yet underground video copies multiplied, traded among those who dared to confront it. Audiences did not watch it for pleasure. They watched it to test their limits. Production stories only added to the myth. The isolated shoot took place over scorching summer weeks with tension between cast and crew. A sense of moral weight pressed on everyone. Even the lead actress Camille Keaton later described it as the hardest experience of her life. Today, I Spit on Your Grave is studied, debated, and reissued uncut. Its power undeniable. Its morality endlessly questioned. It is not entertainment. It is a mirror held up to violence and what vengeance does to the soul. Number 13, The Driller Killer, 1979. Released at the dawn of the 1980s, Abel Ferrara's The Driller Killer blurred the line between underground art and sheer nightmare. It followed a struggling New York artist who descends into madness roaming city streets at night with a power drill as his weapon. It was intended as a portrait of urban despair, but tabloids turned it into a monster headline, banned on video shelves across Britain when its VHS cover showing a man's skull being drilled shocked politicians and parents alike. Ferrara never meant it as cheap horror, but the controversy consumed it. Authorities labeled it one of the worst of the video nasties. In raids across England, copies were seized. Ferrara himself claimed ignorance of the marketing that made it infamous. The uncut version vanished from circulation for nearly a decade. Behind the camera, the film was made guerrilla style on real New York streets, using friends as extras and rundown apartments as sets. The realism only deepened its menace. Audiences believed what they saw was authentic madness unfolding. When The Driller Killer resurfaced in the late 1990s, Critics reevaluated it as a work of punk cinema, an expression of frustration and economic decay. Its banning only amplified its legend. It remains less a slasher and more a fever dream of a city eating its own. Number 12, Faces of Death, 1978. It began as a rumor whispered in back rooms of video stores. Faces of Death was said to contain real footage of people dying on camera. The tagline claimed it was banned in 46 countries, and that was not far from truth. Directed by John Allen Schwartz under a pseudonym, it was part documentary, part staged nightmare, and 100% controversy. The premise was simple, yet horrifying. A pathologist guides viewers through scenes of death across the world, showing everything from executions to accidents to animal cruelty. But what disturbed audiences most was not knowing what was real and what was staged. The uncertainty became the horror. People fainted in theaters. Others walked out in silence. Critics called it moral rot. Governments called it obscene. In Britain, it was seized during the infamous video nasty crackdown of the early 80s. In Germany, it was banned for decades. In the United States, it was quietly pulled from shelves after protests from religious groups. The director later revealed that nearly half the footage had been recreated using practical effects, but by then, it was too late. The myth was already immortal. Behind the scenes, the editing process was grueling. Footage came from news archives, morgues, and staged scenes shot in Los Angeles warehouses. The crew reportedly suffered nightmares during production. The film's fake segments were so convincing that even law enforcement questioned their authenticity. Decades later, Faces of Death became a strange cultural relic, a forbidden film that teenagers dared each other to watch. It spawned sequels, copycats, and a legend that refused to die. Today it is less a movie and more a mirror, showing how easily fascination and fear can blur into obsession. Faces of Death proved one chilling truth. Curiosity can be far deadlier than the images themselves. Number 11, Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. There are movies that shock, and then there is Cannibal Holocaust. Directed by Ruggero Deodato, it was so convincing that authorities believed it was a real snuff film. The story followed a film crew who disappeared while documenting cannibal tribes in the Amazon, only for their lost footage to be discovered later. What the camera revealed was pure nightmare. Audiences in Italy screamed and fled theaters. Critics called for Deodato's arrest. Within days, the film was confiscated, and the director charged with murder because prosecutors thought the killings were real. He had to bring the actors into court alive to prove his innocence. That alone tells you how realistic the film appeared. Censors around the world banned it almost instantly. In Britain, it was outlawed for over 20 years. In Australia, customs officers seized every copy that entered the country. In America, it circulated underground, passed between collectors like contraband. Each viewing became an act of rebellion. The production itself was brutal, filmed deep in the Amazon jungle with minimal safety and little communication with locals. Crew members faced sickness, injury, and near mutiny. The animal deaths on screen were real, sparking protests that still echo today. Even Deodato later expressed regret, saying he had gone too far in pursuit of realism. Yet decades later, Cannibal Holocaust is recognized as one of the most influential horror films ever made. It pioneered the found footage format long before the Blair Witch Project and inspired a new wave of extreme cinema. Critics who once condemned it now debate its message about Western exploitation and media hypocrisy. Its horror was not just on screen, it was in what it revealed about us, that sometimes the camera is not a witness, it is an accomplice. Number 10, Men Behind the Sun, 1988. Few films are as unbearable as Men Behind the Sun. Directed by T.F. Mu, this Chinese production depicted the atrocities committed by Japan's infamous Unit 731 during World War II. It was not an exaggeration, it was a reenactment of documented horrors that governments had spent decades trying to bury. The film's tone was unrelenting, cold, clinical, and emotionless. Viewers watched experiments on prisoners, frostbite tests, vivisections, and gas chamber simulations. Even though many effects were prosthetic, they were executed with terrifying realism. Rumors spread that the production used real corpses, a claim that the director never fully denied. Upon release, it was banned across much of Asia. Japanese authorities condemned it as inflammatory propaganda. Western distributors refused to touch it. In Hong Kong, protests broke out demanding it be destroyed. The outrage, however, only fueled curiosity. Smuggled VHS copies soon circulated among underground collectors, turning it into one of the most sought-after banned films in history. Behind the scenes, Mu insisted that the film was a history lesson, not exploitation. He cast unknown actors and shot in freezing conditions to evoke genuine suffering. Crew members reportedly cried during scenes unable to continue filming. When the film resurfaced in the late 90s, critics were divided. Some called it essential truth-telling. Others labeled it inhuman. Either way, Men Behind the Sun forced audiences to confront atrocities that textbooks ignored. It remains banned in Japan to this day, but its legacy endures as a reminder that some horrors are too real to dramatize and too painful to forget. Number 9. Necromantic, 1987. It was not just banned, it was buried. German director Jörg Buttgereit's Necromantic became one of the most reviled and whispered about films of the decade. On the surface, it was a low-budget art house experiment. Beneath that surface, it was an unflinching dive into loneliness, decay, and the collapse of morality. The film followed a street cleaner who removes corpses from accident scenes. Obsessed with death, he steals one and brings it home as a bizarre companion. What unfolds is both grotesque and deeply tragic, a descent into madness filmed with the detached eye of a poet staring at rot. Audiences were unprepared. Film festivals refused to screen it. German authorities banned it almost immediately, citing it as a threat to public morality. Police raided underground screenings and confiscated reels. Yet this censorship only made it more notorious. College students traded bootleg VHS copies wrapped in plain sleeves like forbidden treasure. Behind the scenes, the film was made on almost no money. Buttgereit shot it on Super 8 film, using real animal organs for props. The cast were friends and fellow artists drawn to the director's strange vision. Despite the revulsion, critics later noted that the film carried surprising beauty in its framing and melancholy. When Necromantic resurfaced in the late 1990s, film scholars began calling it a dark masterpiece. It inspired an entire wave of underground filmmakers who used horror not for thrills, but for emotional dissection. In the end, Necromantic was not about shock for its own sake. It was about the isolation that comes when a soul becomes too familiar with death. A film that turned disgust into art and censorship into immortality. Number 8. Thriller. A Cruel Picture, 1973. Although released in the early 70s, Thriller: A Cruel Picture became a cult legend in the 80s, thanks to home video reissues and word of mouth from those who claimed to have seen the banned version. Directed by Bo Arne Vibenius, this Swedish exploitation film starred Christina Lindberg as a mute woman forced into a life of violence who later exacts brutal revenge. It combined art house style with extreme violence and was marketed as Sweden's answer to Clockwork Orange. But what truly set it apart was its intensity. Slow-motion shootouts, meticulously choreographed stunts, and a haunting performance from Lindberg made it unforgettable. Authorities, however, saw nothing artistic. The uncut version was banned in its home country and heavily censored across Europe. It was even seized in the United States, where the explicit violence triggered legal battles over obscenity laws. The few surviving uncut reels became collector holy grails. Behind the scenes, Vibenius used his own money to fund the production after studios refused to touch it. The film was shot over months in isolated Swedish countryside locations, with crew members working in secrecy. Lindberg, who had never held a gun before, trained extensively for her revenge scenes, which later influenced Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill decades later. By the mid-80s, Thriller had achieved mythic status. Fans circulated grainy VHS copies, and film scholars debated whether it was trash or brilliance. When it finally resurfaced in full form, its artistry stunned new audiences. Thriller: A Cruel Picture remains a paradox. Too brutal to dismiss, yet too skillful to ignore. A haunting relic that forced cinema to confront its obsession with vengeance. Number 7. Deadbeat at Dawn, 1988. In a decade obsessed with excess, Deadbeat at Dawn was pure chaos. Directed by Jim Van Beber and shot on the gritty streets of Dayton, Ohio, it was the ultimate outlaw film. A gang leader trying to escape crime is pulled back into a storm of betrayal and carnage. This was no Hollywood action fantasy. Every stunt, every fight, every wound looked real because most of them were. Van Beber performed many of his own stunts, often without safety measures. He broke bones during filming and used real locations filled with danger. The result was a raw punk energy, unlike anything seen before. Censors and distributors panicked. The violence was so intense that theaters refused to show it. The MPAA refused to rate it. In Britain, it was banned under the Video Recordings Act for being excessively violent. Yet underground audiences hailed it as revolutionary. They saw truth in its grit. They saw rebellion in its fury. Behind the scenes, Van Beber lived the same chaos he filmed. The budget was barely enough to rent cameras. Friends served as cast and crew. The editing was done in borrowed studios late at night. That raw desperation bled into every frame. When it resurfaced years later, critics recognized it as a landmark of independent filmmaking. Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez later cited it as influence. It became a blueprint for the grindhouse revival of the 90s. Deadbeat at Dawn was not a polished film. It was a war cry, a declaration that art could still bleed. Number 6, The Last House on Dead End Street, 1977. It existed like a myth passed through whispers of midnight screenings and bootleg tapes. The Last House on Dead End Street was a film so disturbing that even its creator Roger Watkins disowned it for years. It began as a student project, but spiraled into one of the most infamous underground horror films ever made. The plot followed a disgraced filmmaker who decides to make snuff-style films for real. What he captures on camera blurs the line between fiction and murder. The result was a grim meditation on power and corruption, disguised as exploitation. Audiences were left shaken, wondering if what they saw was real. When it surfaced in the late 70s, it was banned across Europe. Distributors refused to handle it, fearing legal consequences. In Britain and Australia, it became a target of police raids. Even in America, theaters screened it under false titles to avoid detection. Its reputation only grew darker as years passed. Behind the scenes, the chaos was real. Watkins filmed it using borrowed cameras with friends as actors in an abandoned building. The production stretched over a year and was plagued by rumors of real violence. The truth was less criminal, but no less disturbing. Every performer was pushed to emotional collapse to capture genuine terror. When rediscovered decades later, it was hailed as a grim masterpiece of nihilism. Critics compared it to art films like Pasolini's Salo, calling it a confrontation with the viewer's own voyeurism. Yet, despite critical re-evaluation, it remains banned in several countries. The Last House on Dead End Street is not simply a film. It is an autopsy of morality and proof that once a camera sees too much, it can never unsee. Number 5, Combat Shock, 1986. Combat Shock arrived quietly, then detonated. Directed by Buddy Giovinazzo, this American independent film followed a Vietnam veteran struggling with poverty trauma and the decaying streets of Staten Island. What began as a war film ended as one of the bleakest visions of human despair ever captured. Audiences expecting action were horrified instead. The film showed addiction violence and mental collapse in raw, unfiltered detail. It was not heroic, it was hopeless. The ending was so harrowing that audiences left theaters in stunned silence. Some called it dangerous, others called it necessary. Censors disagreed. It was banned in several countries for its graphic, realism, and grim subject matter. In the United Kingdom, it joined the infamous Video Nasty list. Television stations refused to air advertisements. Even distributors trimmed scenes to avoid government backlash. Yet, underground horror fans traded it relentlessly, turning it into legend. Behind the camera, Giovinazzo poured his own trauma into the story. His brother played the lead role, living in real slum apartments during filming to embody despair. The production budget was microscopic. Real urban decay became the set design. There were no special effects, only brutal honesty. Years later, critics revisited Combat Shock and called it a lost classic of the Reagan era. It inspired filmmakers like Darren Aronofsky and Gaspar Noé. It stood as a counterpoint to Rambo and other glamorized war stories. Combat Shock proved that sometimes horror is not found in monsters. It is found in the world we return to after war. Number 4, The Evil Dead, 1981. Sam Raimi was barely 20 when he made The Evil Dead. What began as a low-budget cabin-in-the-woods project turned into a global scandal. Critics hailed its creativity. Censors saw only danger. The film's mixture of supernatural gore and relentless energy shocked audiences who had never seen anything like it. When it hit the United Kingdom, it landed on the video nasty list almost immediately. Police seized tapes from stores. Religious groups demanded it be banned. Authorities claimed its demonic imagery could corrupt viewers. Ironically, every attempt to suppress it only fueled its popularity. The production itself was an endurance test. Shot deep in Tennessee, Wood's The Young cast endured freezing nights, fake blood by the gallon, and injuries from improvised stunts. Raimi mortgaged his family home to finish it. The exhaustion and fear you see on screen were real. Despite censorship, it became a cult phenomenon. Stephen King called it ferociously original. Audiences passed bootleg copies hand to hand until it spread worldwide. Sequels followed, and its star Bruce Campbell became a pop culture icon. But the real story was its transformation from banned horror to beloved classic. Today, The Evil Dead is preserved by film archives, taught in universities, and regarded as one of the greatest independent horror films ever made. It was proof that censorship can bury a film, but it cannot kill it. Sometimes the banned become the immortal. A number 3, Visitors, a 1988. In Japan's underground horror scene, few titles provoked as much fear or confusion as Visitors. Directed by Kenichi Kato and produced by a splinter crew of effects artists from the Guinea Pig series, it blurred the line between art experiment and psychological torture. The film followed a young woman who moves into a sterile Tokyo apartment, only to find her reflection behaving independently, at first mimicking her, then mocking her, and finally taking her place. What began as a meditation on urban loneliness turned into a visual assault. The imagery was so graphic: self-mutilation, surgical obsession, and surreal dismemberment that Japanese censors immediately seized the negatives. Authorities labeled it spiritually corrupt. Only a handful of VHS test copies escaped destruction, circulating through horror festivals in Europe under the nickname The Mirror Film. Behind the scenes, the production was chaotic. Kato filmed in a condemned high-rise without permits, using experimental lighting that gave the footage its sickly, clinical glow. Real medical prosthetics were imported from hospital suppliers to heighten realism. Crew members claimed they suffered hallucinations from the constant strobe lighting. When the police raided the editing suite in 1989, they confiscated every reel and arrested 2 distributors for visual obscenity. For decades, Visitors remained unseen, spoken of only in collector forums and whispered about in the same breath as Cannibal Holocaust or Necromantic. A partial restoration surfaced in 2015, revealing that beneath its gore lay a disturbing poetry about identity, body, and decay. Visitors was banned not for what it showed, but for what it suggested, that horror could live inside the ordinary act of seeing oneself. Number 2, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. When Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer premiered, it did not receive applause. It received silence. Directed by John McNaughton, it was based loosely on real-life murderer Henry Lee Lucas and filmed with chilling restraint. There were no flashy kills or cheap thrills, just cold observation. The film followed Henry and his drifter companion Otis as they wandered Chicago, leaving random death in their wake. What made it unbearable was its realism. The violence was quick, emotionless, and filmed like a documentary. Audiences left theaters disturbed not by gore, but by how ordinary the killers appeared. Censors around the world reacted immediately. The Motion Picture Association refused to grant it a standard rating. British authorities demanded over 50 cuts. Many theaters refused to show it altogether. It was labeled dangerous to the public mind. For years, it remained unreleased or heavily edited until the early 90s. Behind the camera, McNaughton made it with little money and less approval. He shot on 60 minutes per film, using real locations without permits. Michael Rooker, in his debut role, immersed himself completely in Henry's psyche, to the point where crew members avoided him off-set. Critics later called his performance one of the most terrifyingly realistic portrayals ever filmed. When it finally resurfaced, critics like Roger Ebert has praised its raw honesty, calling it a horror film about the absence of emotion rather than the presence of violence. Over time, it gained cult status and is now preserved as a significant work in American independent cinema. Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer remains banned or heavily restricted in several countries. Its message still burns. True evil does not scream, it whispers. Number 1. A Serbian Film, 1989. Although officially released years later, its roots and censorship legacy trace back to the late 80s exploitation movement. A Serbian Film became the ultimate example of how far cinema could push the boundary of endurance. Directed by Srđan Spasojević, it was conceived as a political allegory. What emerged was one of the most controversial films in history. The film's story followed a retired actor drawn into making an art film that spirals into unimaginable cruelty. But beyond the surface, Shock lay a metaphor about censorship exploitation and the destruction of humanity under corrupt systems. Still, no amount of symbolism could protect it from outrage. Governments in multiple countries banned it completely. Screenings were halted mid-reel. Police seized projectors. In Spain and Brazil, film festival organizers were arrested for showing it. Even the edited version was outlawed in Norway, New Zealand, and parts of the United Kingdom. Behind the scenes, Spasojević insisted it was not meant for shock alone, but as protest art against censorship and political decay. The production faced death threats, protests, and years of legal battles. Many of the cast members distanced themselves after release, citing trauma and public backlash. Critics were divided. Some called it genius for exposing hypocrisy in art and politics. Others called it unforgivable. Its reputation spread through whispers, not advertising. And just like the banned films of the 80s before it, A Serbian Film became the forbidden fruit of modern cinema. It asks one unbearable question. How much truth can a viewer handle before the screen must go dark? These films were banned for crossing lines. But perhaps what truly terrified censors was not the blood. It was the mirror. Each story forced audiences to face the darkest parts of themselves and of society. Which of these banned films do you think went too far? Let us know below. Like, subscribe, and keep exploring cinema's forbidden vault.